When a person first picks up the Bible, they rarely feel that what lies before them is the result of a choice. Most often, it appears as a finished, closed book, as if it has always existed in this exact form. As if, at some point, truth was gathered into a single whole, and from that moment on, never changed. But no book that truly shaped human history came into being that way. The Bible is no exception. Its story does not begin with the canon. It does not begin with the church. It begins with people trying to understand what had happened to them. They had seen a man. They had heard his voice. They had listened to his words. And then, they lost him. After the death of Jesus, there was no Christianity as we know it today. There was no single faith. No structure. No doctrine. No definitive answer to the question of who he truly was. There were only memories. Fragments of words. Different interpretations. And a great many questions. For some, he was the Messiah, the one who was meant to change the world but did not complete his mission. For others, a prophet. For some, a teacher who showed a path toward inner awakening. And for others still, a being of an entirely different order than a mere human. These views did not compete with one another. They existed side by side. People did not argue about a canon. They simply tried to understand what it all meant. They gathered in homes. They spoke in whispers. They passed stories from mouth to mouth. Some wrote them down. Some copied them. Some added explanations, because without them the meaning would slip away. That is how the texts emerged. Not as Holy Scripture, but as testimony. These texts were not written for future generations. They were written for the present moment. To remember. To explain. To preserve an experience. Many of them had no single author. They changed over time. They were expanded. They were copied again and again. And no one saw a problem in that. Because faith had not yet become a rigid formula. It was still a living process. The problem appeared when faith ceased to be the matter of small communities. Christianity began to grow. It moved beyond private homes. Beyond individual cities. Beyond the narrow circle of eyewitnesses. And with that growth came tension. Because one Jesus meant many images of him. One path meant many directions. One faith meant many truths. At some point, this ceased to be merely a spiritual problem. It became a practical one. How do people live together if they believe differently? How do you build a community when texts contradict one another? How do you preserve unity when faith itself gives rise to chaos? It was at this moment that the need for selection emerged. At the moment when faith began to take the shape of a system, the relationship to words changed. The text ceased to be merely a testimony of lived experience. It became an instrument. And any instrument must function predictably. As long as texts existed side by side, faith remained a movement. People could compare, doubt, ask questions. But for an institution that was only just forming, movement quickly turned into a threat. That is why a question arose that could no longer be avoided. Which texts should remain, and which should be set aside? These decisions were not made by prophets or mystics. They were made by people responsible for order, stability, and the survival of the community. The criteria were simple, but severe. Does this text support unity? Does it strengthen structure? Does it make faith understandable and manageable? The texts that met these requirements began to be read more often. They were copied again and again. Gradually, they acquired the status of being correct. Other texts were not openly banned. They were not declared enemies of the faith. They were not burned in public squares. They were simply no longer copied. In a world where a text exists only as long as someone is willing to spend time, candlelight, and their own eyesight to preserve it, this meant a slow disappearance. Without orders. Without verdicts. Without noise. Sometimes the most effective form of prohibition is silence. This is how many texts that we now call apocrypha began to fade from view. Not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient. They did not build faith around fear. They did not make a person obedient. They did not remove responsibility. They spoke of an inner path. One such text was the Gospel of Thomas. It is not a narrative in the usual sense. There is no plot, no climax, no drama. There are only sayings, short, direct, almost sharp. They do not explain what to believe. They force the reader to look inward. The idea that the kingdom of God is within you appears simple. But for a system, it was dangerous. Because if truth is inside a person, then a mediator becomes optional. And structure becomes conditional. Such texts could not serve as the foundation of a mass religion. But Thomas was not the only one. There were texts that touched an even more sensitive nerve. The need for simple evil. In the familiar tradition, the figure of Judas was convenient. He allowed the story to remain clear. There is a betrayer. There is a victim. There is black and white. There is guilt. But in alternative texts, this simplicity disappears. Judas does not become a hero. He is not justified. But he is no longer reduced to caricatured evil. He becomes a human being placed in a situation where every possible choice leads to tragedy. A person who takes upon himself a role that others refuse to take. This image was dangerous not because it changed the plot, but because it removed a comfortable moral division. It forced the believer to look not at a symbol, but at a person. And a faith that sees a person is always more complex than a faith that sees only roles. There was yet another text, more disturbing than all the rest. The Book of Enoch. It did not speak about sin. And it did not speak about punishment. It spoke about knowledge. About a boundary that cannot be crossed without consequences. About awareness as a point of no return. In this text, the greatest fear is not disobedience, but understanding. Because once understanding occurs, the world can no longer be seen as simple. This motif is ancient. Knowledge as a threat. Insight as a risk. Such texts did not create obedience. They created responsibility. And that is why they could survive only in the shadows. There is a moment when any living tradition ceases to be alive. It happens quietly. Without decrees. Without councils. Without proclamations. At some point, questions simply stop being asked. This is exactly what happened with the canon. As long as texts were discussed, compared, interpreted in different ways, faith remained a movement. But over time, this movement began to interfere. Each new interpretation opened the possibility of division. Each new question, of instability. And then a shift occurred. What had once been a process became a result. What had once been a search became a norm. What could be reinterpreted became untouchable. The canon was not closed in a single day. It simply ceased to be open. And this difference is crucial. When something is forbidden, resistance arises. But when something is simply no longer discussed, silence appears. It was within this silence that apocryphal texts began to lose their place. Not because they contradicted truth, but because they contradicted finality. They reminded people that faith is a path. And the system could no longer afford a path. It needed an outcome. At this point, the text ceases to be a dialogue partner. It becomes an authority. And any other word standing next to authority begins to look like a threat. Apocryphal texts did not say, "This is false." They said, "This is not the only way." And that was enough. Over time, Apocrypha came to be associated not with searching, but with danger. Not because they led to chaos, but because they did not guarantee identical results. A person could read and understand differently. Could take another path. Could fail to fit in. For a system, this is unacceptable. And here one thing must be said clearly. The Church did not destroy these texts out of malice. It acted as any structure seeking survival would act. It chose stability. And stability always has a cost. That cost was the gradual loss of the inner dimension of faith as the primary one. Not completely, but slowly. Apocryphal texts spoke not of what to believe, but of how to be. And that cannot be standardized. That is why they survived only in the shadows. They passed from hand to hand, from language to language, from generation to generation, sometimes as fragments, sometimes as ideas without names, sometimes as thoughts that no longer had a source. People might not have known they were reading an apocryphon, but they felt it was something different, something that does not command, something that does not frighten, something that does not promise. And it was precisely these texts that found those for whom ready-made answers were no longer enough. This is how mystical traditions emerged. This is how movements later labeled heretical appeared. This is how paths arose that never became dominant. Because official history prefers straight lines, but real history prefers branches. Apocrypha are not extra books. They are traces of other possibilities. It was thanks to individual people that these texts did not disappear entirely. Imagine a monk. Late night. Stone walls. The light of a single candle. Before him lies a manuscript that is not read in church. A text not discussed aloud. A text for which no one gives thanks. He knows this text will never become canon. And yet he copies it. Not out of rebellion. Not out of a desire to change the world. But from the feeling that if he does not, something important will vanish forever. This is how the Apocrypha reached us. Not thanks to the system, but in spite of it. There is one pattern that is easy to miss when we look at history from a distance. Interest in forbidden texts never appears in times of stability. It emerges when ready-made answers stop working. When the world becomes more complex than the rules offered to explain it. When old formulas no longer describe what is happening inside a person. When faith, once a source of support, begins to feel like an instruction written for a different era. It is precisely at such moments that people turn back to apocryphal texts. Not in order to destroy faith. And not in search of scandal. But in search of depth. Forbidden texts were never meant to be popular. And perhaps they were never meant to be. They do not create a shared identity. They do not offer the comfort of, we are all the same. They do not promise that the path will be simple or clear. Instead, they offer something else. An encounter with oneself. And here a tension arises that still exists today. Because every large religious system is built on trust in an external authority. Apocryphal texts quietly undermine this logic. They do not say, do not believe. They do not say, destroy. They say, do not abandon your own experience. And that is precisely what makes them dangerous. Modern people often believe they live in an age of freedom. That there are no forbidden books anymore. That everything is now accessible. But access is not the same as readiness. Not everyone is prepared to read texts that offer no moral support. Not everyone is ready to remain without a clear answer. Not everyone is willing to take responsibility for their own understanding of faith. In this sense, apocryphal texts remain dangerous even today. They do not attack belief. They attack habit. The habit of thinking that someone else has already decided everything. The habit of living within permitted questions. The habit of accepting ready-made truth instead of personal searching. Perhaps that is why these texts remained on the margins of history for so long. Not because they were feared as falsehood, but because of fear of who a person becomes after reading them. Because a person who begins to think independently ceases to be predictable. And no system welcomes unpredictability. If we look at history without illusions, one thing becomes clear. The canon was neither a conspiracy nor a deception. It was a compromise. A compromise between depth and stability. Between searching and order. Between a question and an answer. The Church chose the answer. The Apocrypha preserved the question. And every generation is forced to decide again. Which one matters more? Today, we have the ability to read these texts. They are no longer hidden in deserts. No longer locked away in monastic libraries. No longer copied in secret at night. But that does not mean they have become harmless. Because the real danger was never in the books themselves. It has always been in what these books do to the reader. They do not comfort. They do not provide firm ground. They do not promise that someone else will carry responsibility for you. They leave you alone with a question. And perhaps this is precisely their true purpose. Not to replace the canon. Not to destroy faith. Not to create a new system. But to remind us that faith does not begin where questions end. It begins where a person dares to ask them. Perhaps that is why these texts were never meant to see the light of day. Not because they were false, but because they were too honest. Honest about human fear. Honest about the complexity of the world. Honest about the fact that truth is not always comfortable. And perhaps the most important question they leave behind is this: do we truly seek truth? Or merely peace? Because between those two things, there has always been a choice. And that choice, just as 1,000 years ago, still belongs to each of us.